Hello, everyone. It is snowing here in New Hampshire, and so I've turned off the ring light because it was totally lighting me out. So I do apologize if the lighting isn't exactly right, but it's better this way, I think, than like not being able to see most of my face because my skin has definitely gone back to its um, usual paleness after a summer of spending it outside with my son, which left me like the most tan of my life, believe it or not. But anyhow, I digress. So in today's video, I want to answer a recent viewer question. I thought this was a wonderful question. And so we are continuing the shadow work series in today's video. And we're talking about a word that I've used a lot in this series, and that's the word integration. And one of you had asked me to just clarify, like, what do I mean when I talk about integration and shadow work? So to integrate, and I'm going to read this to you. I'm going to read you the dictionary definition is to combine one thing with another so that they become a whole, or so that they form a whole, right? So when we are talking about integration, we're looking at combining or uniting an aspect of ourselves that we have separated ourselves from, divorced ourselves from, that we're not acknowledging in our lives. And the purpose of the shadow work is to integrate the shadow or this rejected aspect of ourselves into the whole of our conscious experience so that we can be fully present to our life's journey, and so that we're not reacting from a space of reliving a past trigger in regards to this shadow self, right? So our goal really is integration and shadow work. And it's been a fascinating experience the last few weeks as I've talked to some of my clients about shadow work. You know, I forget because it's been a buzzword in the spiritual online community for a while that a lot of people are still confused, like, is shadow work making a deal with a demon? No, that's not shadow work. That's a different occult experience. We're not summoning demons here in shadow work. What we're really focusing on are these fractured, fragmented aspects of ourselves and integrating them into the whole so that we can be fully present. So when I say in a video in this series that our goal is integration, or that our tarot work here is supposed to assist us in integrating the fractured or fragmented aspect of ourselves, that's what I'm speaking to. So again, I thought this was a wonderful question. And this is a fundamental of our shadow work. And so that's our purpose when we are engaging in, whether it's the tarot work, if you're following this particular series, or if you're working with a meditative practice, any way in which you're engaging in shadow work, even dialogue with a therapist, right? Or dialogue with a trusted friend, or dialogue in your journal, right? The goal of that is integration and full presence, right? Because that's how we want to show up in our life. I think all of us, no matter what spiritual path we're following, no matter, you know, who we identify as, we're really looking for being able to be fully present to an experience. And I know for myself, as someone who dealt with a lot of significant childhood trauma, from childhood into my early adult years, the way in which we're often reacting based on past traumatic events can really be debilitating and crippling to having a new experience. And so for me personally, years and years and years ago, what drew me to an alternative spiritual path, and then what really drew me into actual shadow work, not the kind of cliche trite thing that's been popular of late. But what drew me to actual shadow work was wanting to be able to be fully present in my experience as Racine now, not as the Racine that experienced trauma at 4, at 5, at 15, at 21, right? So if you are feeling that way as well yourself, if you're wanting to experience that full presence, then shadow work is definitely something that you may find very helpful, and a very visceral yet beautiful tool in your toolkit. Okay, so, and I always say, and I preface everything in the shadow work series with, Don't step into shadow work if you've just been triggered and you're currently in trauma, an experience of trauma. You really want to be very balanced when you approach this, because your end goal is the integration, which is why I will always say, when we're summing up a tarot spread or when we finished a journey in shadow work, we're going to finish with, how do we integrate now? So how can I bring this information now that I have forward so that I can unite this fragmented part of the self? So as an example, just give me 1 second. I'm chilly, so my nose is running and I didn't want to do that on camera. So thank you for your patience there. So I'll give you an example of how we can experience integration in shadow work, right? So let's say that we find ourselves afraid to step away from a relationship in our life that is toxic. Now, that doesn't have to be romantic. This can be a relationship with a family member, with a friend. It could be a dynamic at work, right? So let's say that we're looking at this, like we keep seeing that we're repeating in some of our relationships in our life, this fear to change the dynamic, right? So we keep kind of staying stuck in the relationship. Like maybe we feel like we're giving a lot and not receiving, but we're afraid to change the dynamic. We're afraid to have communication with the individual so that we can shift the energy of the dynamic. And then the situation keeps staying the same, right? And then maybe we abruptly end that connection, whether that's a family member, a friend, a work situation, whatever it is. And then we start another connection and we see that, oh my God, I stepped right back into the same pattern. Now it's a different person, but I'm literally repeating the same pattern with this individual. I feel like I'm giving too much. I'm not getting enough back from them. I'm too scared to have a conversation with them. Things get so bad that I end up having to actually cut the connection off, right? So this is an example of what might lead us to decide to work with shadow work around this area, okay? So that may draw us to the cards. And that's why in the shadow work, we want to ask and work with a process that I was taught is called inquiry, right? Which is where we ask those questions to get underneath the layers, right? And there's plenty of videos in this series that I have showing that. I'm not going to go into that right now. There's also plenty of other healers and readers who have tutorials on inquiry. So feel free to just do a Google search on that if you're feeling a little confused about that. But let's say we turn to the cards to look at, why do I keep repeating this pattern? And we get to the understanding and awareness that, like, maybe at 5 years old, we had a parent who went through a traumatic experience of their own and they started leaning on us, right? And then we had a dynamic in childhood where this parent, whichever one, was leaning on us. And it created a situation where we became the parent of our parent, right? So now we know, like, okay, that started around 5 for me. So I know that the fractured part of myself, that fracturing occurred at 5. And I can see how when I'm engaging in these current relationships now, these current friendships, connections with family members, work dynamics, I'm actually reacting like my 5-year-old self, right? I'm not showing up present. I'm reacting from the trauma self, and that around that age when that happened. So that's the shadow work that got us to this space. So now we know we're with the 5-year-old self, right? The integration happens when we start to acknowledge and honor the 5-year-old's experience. And instead of saying, suck it up, buttercup, you've got to deal with it, we really dialogue with the 5-year-old within ourselves, honoring what this experience was for them. And we honor it by acknowledging it. Now then from there, so that's part of the integration process, and I talk about that a lot. That's been huge for me in my own personal journey. We honor the experience, we call it out, we name it, we say it out loud, we write it down, we go through meditation and experience it in the body, right? And then we start to call the 5-year-old back into the fold. So the 5-year-old that lost their ability to have any of their needs met besides food and shelter, right? We call that 5-year-old self back into our experience, into our self. And you'll find in some shamanic techniques, you'll actually like do a practice or a journey where you find where that fractured aspect of yourself is in your energetic being. And you can even actually call that self in, connect with that self and allow a visualization of an integration to happen there as well. But our ultimate goal is that we're integrating the 5-year-old. The 5-year-old no longer has to be fractured from ourselves. We can call that in and integrate it so that when we now engage in connections, friendships, relationships, family dynamics, coworker, or, dealing with a dynamic at work where there's maybe a power struggle, we can show up as a whole being instead of responding like the 5-year-old who's really, really frustrated that their experience has never been honored and tends to act out and show up in that shadow aspect, okay? So that's the goal of the shadow work. It's to create the integration so that we can be fully present and we're not reacting from an unconscious 5-year-old fragmented, fractured self, to use that example. So this is why as part of shadow work, I often will talk to you about you hit that wall where you don't want to go any farther. Like there's that, and your shadow is actually underneath that. And that's why we ask those questions to peel back layers and get down into that energy. But we don't just stop there. If you just uncover that and then you walk away, you're doing more damage than if you never did this work. That's why we have to integrate. Integration is the goal. It's an essential part of the shadow work journey. And it's not something that I ever want you to not do. So I want you to give yourself time to integrate that self. And how you do that, as I just said, you are visualizing, honoring, dialoguing, offering that part of your self-love and understanding, consciously bringing it back into the physical body, and then continuing to check in with that self. Because the ego self, the conscious self, has probably been pretty hard on that fractured shadow part of the self, right? Because that we were told that self wasn't allowed to exist. That's not a part of the fold if you want to survive in this dynamic, right? So we've fragmented that. So we're going to have to come back to, and this is like an upkeep process, right? Just like with tarot. If you don't work with the cards for 6 months, you forget some of the meanings, right? We have to keep integrating that 5-year-old self. We have to keep remembering to dialogue with the 5-year-old self and offer the 5-year-old self love. When we want to go into that, like, instead of communicating honestly with the dynamic, the person on the other side of that dynamic, that we feel our needs aren't being met here, that 5-year-old self isn't going to say anything and then cut and run, right? Maybe that might be how it manifests for you. When we're able to practice integration, we can then, from a very grounded space, choose to dialogue with the individual instead of having the 5-year-old's reaction. So that's the purpose, of integration. And I hope if this has felt confusing for you, or you're not quite sure, like, why does Racine keep using this word when we're doing the shadow work series? It's because it's an essential part of this process, and it's really important. And the most important thing you can offer those fractured, fragmented parts of yourself is love. It's understanding, it's honoring, it's awareness, and it's love. And that sounds so easy, and it's actually one of the most difficult things to do. To just honor the fragmented aspect of ourselves, their story, instead of justifying the experience that we had at that age that caused the fracturing, that caused the fragmentation. That's where that love ends up serving to integrate. And it sounds easy, and it's fucking hard. It's fucking hard to do that, especially if you've had some significant trauma in your life, which again is why I'm always going to say to you, don't engage in shadow work unless you're feeling grounded, unless you're feeling centered, unless you feel good. In the moment of being triggered is not time to decide to go into inquiry. It's when you're able to be present and to be very grounded to do this work and to offer yourself the integration that you're ready to experience. And it's why shadow work is also, in my experience, a lifelong practice, because we're always peeling back the layers of that onion. It's never done, right? It's not like I'm saved, so now I never have to worry about anything. It's not like that. All of these spiritual practices involve upkeep, and they involve us showing up. They involve commitment. They involve commitment on our part towards ourselves, which can be difficult to offer ourselves if we have a large amount of fragmentation or fracturing that's happened in our experience. But it's absolutely worth it. This type of work It's not like going out and buying something and you get that high right away, but long term, when you see the changes that you've made and how you react to things and how you show up in your life, I guarantee you will feel that it is very much worth it. So those are my thoughts on integration and shadow work. And this is when I use that word in our shadow work series on this channel, that is what I am referring to. So I hope that this clarified this question for the viewer who asked it. I want to thank them for asking. It was an insightful question. And if you all have any other questions now that you've watched this, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And I look at the questions. I don't always have time to answer everyone, but I do have a list of viewer request videos, and I always add to that list after looking at your comments on videos such as these. So I am sending you all so much love and many blessings. Happy New Year, and I will see you in the next video.